She tried desperately to wrench her foot free from the jaws of the killer whale, but she was stuck. The lifeless eye of the orca stared at her as he dragged her even deeper. All she could do was scream into the water, watching the bubbles of her last breath float to the surface. From crushing blows to missing limbs, these are the 4 worst orca attacks in human history. There's a reason they call them killer whales. As always, viewer discretion is advised. When I think about Christmas, I think of lights and trees, eggnog, last-minute gifts, and time with family. But this isn't that kind of holiday story. On Christmas Eve morning in 2009, Estefania Rodriguez heard her phone ring. She looked at the display and saw her fiancé's name, Alexis Martinez. She answered, expecting to hear the love of her life. What she didn't know was that she would never hear Alexis's voice ever again. It was a call from Loro Parque, one of the largest tourist attractions in the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa. It was also where her fiancé worked as a trainer, a job that Alexis loved. Loro Parque had all kinds of animals, from red pandas to gorillas, lions, lemurs, and sloths. But the park's most famous attraction was its killer whales, housed in a section of the park called Orca Ocean. Alexis was one of the best orca trainers at the park. I can't imagine the pressure of caring for a killer whale. And on top of that, putting on shows and getting these wild beasts to be on their best behavior for the crowds of people who paid money to see them. Alexis had to be extremely careful about training his orcas to listen to his cues, and he also made sure they were healthy and happy. But the problem was that Alexis was bothered by what was happening at the park. He worked every day with the killer whales. He fed them, gave them medicines, and monitored their behavior. But he knew that something was wrong. Very wrong. He told his fiancée that he worried that something could happen at any time. If you've watched my channel, you know that I cover a lot of pretty awful mistakes and horrific injuries. Even if you're not around killer whales like Alexis, it seems like freak injuries are everywhere you look. And here's something you might not know. If you ever do find yourself seriously hurt, your injury could be worth millions. That's where Morgan & Morgan comes in. They fight back when insurance companies try to lowball your claim if you become their client. They recently secured verdicts of $12 million in Florida and $26 million in Philadelphia, 34 and 40 times higher than the initial offers, respectively. And even better, their fee is absolutely free unless you win your case. If you ever got seriously injured, your case could be worth millions, and you're only a few easy cell phone clicks away from potentially changing your life. It's really easy. You can start your claim now with Morgan & Morgan at www.forthepeople.com/extreme. You can check the description or scan the QR code on screen to get started. Going back to Alexis and his tragic story, the problem was that one whale named Keto wasn't happy, and it was the whale that Alexis was worrying about. Keto was born in captivity, so he'd never seen the ocean. He'd never used his natural killer instincts to hunt. He was born in SeaWorld in Florida before being shipped over 4,000 miles away to the Canary Islands. But ever since Keto arrived, the 6,600-pound whale had been giving the park problems. He wouldn't listen to the trainers. He stopped obeying orders partway through shows. The 14-year-old orca was even being aggressive at times with the other whales. Alexis tried very hard to help Keto adjust to his life in a new tank, but he was struggling with his workload. So, when Estefania answered the call that morning and heard the voice of Alexis's boss, she knew that Alexis had been right. Something very bad had happened, but all they told her was that Alexis was being taken to the hospital because of an incident at the pool. Was it serious? Was Alexis injured? She pushed, but they refused to give her more information. In a panic, Estefania hopped in her car to find Alexis. They'd been together for 7 years, and they had only just moved in together. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. With rising panic, Estefania finally arrived at the hospital, and what she saw there terrified her even further. In the lobby of the hospital was Loro Parque's president, along with another stern-looking man, the park's lawyer. Soon after she arrived, Estefania learned that Alexis wasn't injured, like she had secretly hoped. Alexis had actually died an hour before she ever got the call from his phone. His worry was real, and he was the victim that proved his own prophecy. As Estefania walked into where Alexis lay, all she could see was his face and head. Everything else was carefully wrapped up in cloth. Doctors told her that Alexis had drowned, and just like the park, they refused to give her any more information. The park wouldn't talk to her, and neither would Alexis's fellow trainers. Someone was working hard to keep this incident a secret. It was several months later when Estefania finally learned the truth about what actually happened that Christmas Eve morning. A terrible truth about exactly how violently Alexis had died. It was a typical morning with Alexis and his orcas. They were frantically trying to get ready for the big Christmas show the next day. Alexis was happy because Keto looked like he was in a good mood. He was listening well and responding to his commands. But without warning, Keto stopped responding and started hunting. During a routine trick, Keto got between Alexis and the safety of the platform. Alexis was in the water and was about to perform a popular trick where he rode on the back of Keto, showing off the crowds in the stands. All of a sudden, Keto turned on Alexis and slammed his nose hard into Alexis's chest, pushing him violently down to the bottom of the pool. Keto had become the predator and his trainer. Alexis would be the prey. The other trainers who knew about Keto's moods tried to get the whale to stop, but Keto was no longer listening. His killer instincts took over as Keto bit again and again, leaving big gashes all over Alexis's body. One trainer finally got Keto's attention as the orca rose to the surface, and he was lifting the body back up to the surface, balancing Alexis on his nose. But when he came out of the water, Alexis just slipped off the orca and fell back to the depths again. Alexis was already dead. Using a tactic orcas use to hunt in the wild, Keto's first blow killed Alexis, causing massive internal injuries. It was that single blow that was enough to crush bones and stop his heart. It took some time, but the trainers were finally able to move Keto to another tank. By then, rescuers felt safe enough to dive to the bottom of the tank and pull up Alexis's body. I can see why the hospital didn't want Estefania to see her fiancé's body. It was covered in gashes, bites, and bruises, evidence of a death that was far from accidental. Nobody should have to see that. And when the truth of Alexis's violent death came out, authorities found that Loro Parque had a history of covering up violent attacks. Just 2 years before, another orca had attacked its trainer. But Alexis never knew that, until it was too late for him. Keto was an actual killer, but he wasn't the worst. It might surprise you to learn that there have only ever been 4 deaths caused by orcas. But 3 of them were caused by the same whale. A true killer with a tally of victims, each more shocking than the last. Anybody who's ever been in the pool with a killer whale is bound to get hurt. Bruises and bumps are normal when you're working with 10,000-pound animals. But up until 1991, no one truly believed that the giant beasts would actually live up to their deadly name, and certainly not 20-year-old Keltie Byrne. She was a whale trainer at Sealand of the Pacific, a popular public aquarium on Vancouver Island, Canada. Most people believed she had the dream career, and it truly was a dream. Every day, Keltie walked into work, excited about working with the most intelligent sea creatures. She was lucky, and she knew it. But Keltie's job was more than just running shows and throwing fish into the whales' mouths. Her task was to keep the orcas happy. Not an easy job. These massive creatures travel entire oceans in pods of dozens. Keeping them in a small tank meant that Keltie needed to keep these whales from going crazy. She had to play with them, teach them new tricks, make sure they got along well with each other, and had enough exercise. On top of everything, Keltie had to be friends with the whales. Again, not an easy job, because Sealand of the Pacific didn't just have 1 orca. They had 3, including the biggest orca ever kept in captivity. His name was Tilikum, or Tilly for short, a massive 12,500-pound orca that came from the waters off Iceland. Tilly had been in captivity for 8 years when Keltie joined the team. Tilly had a big personality, and the trainers learned to read his moods. Some days, Tilly was fun and playful. On other days, They took one look in his eye and said, "Nope, not getting near the water today." But there was a problem at Sealand. Even though Tilly was big, he was getting bullied. The other two female orcas saw Tilly as a threat. They pushed him around. They raked their sharp teeth along his body until he was scratched raw. They didn't let him play with them. Orcas thrive on relationships, and so when he was made the outcast, he didn't react well. But in spite of this, Keltie loved him all the same. She worked daily with him. She taught him to perform flips and waves and moves for the crowds that visited the aquarium. She fed him his favorite fish. And this is why it's so surprising what Tilly did one random Wednesday afternoon. On a typically rainy day, February 20th, 1991, Keltie ran through her normal routines with the whales. After some checks of the pools and the animals, Keltie got ready for the afternoon show. She gathered the whales' favorite playthings. She packed herring into coolers to give as treats. And then, when the crowds arrived, Keltie gave them an exciting display of these beautiful animals. After all the people had left to see the other animals in the aquarium, Keltie started cleaning up around the pool. To unwind the animals after a rigorous show, Keltie liked to give the orcas some playtime. It was meant to be fun. It was meant to let the whales blow off some energy. But it wasn't meant to turn into a tragedy. Keltie gathered up the balls and floaties. She picked up her cooler of fish. But as she walked alongside the orcas, she somehow stumbled into the pool. At first, she seemed fine and tried to climb out of the pool, but that's when Keltie felt the presence of Tilly behind her. Without warning, Tilly grabbed Keltie's foot and pulled her back into the water. Her screams were cut off as Tilly dragged Keltie helplessly down to the bottom of the pool. Other trainers heard Keltie's frantic screams and ran to the pool to help. But the orcas weren't listening to any of the normal cues. The whistles had no effects. Slaps on the water were doing nothing. Tilly was worked up and ready to play. And instead of balls and fish, Keltie became Tilly's new toy. Her body bobbed up and down in the water as the orcas pushed and pulled her around the tank. And every time Keltie's head broke free, she desperately gasped enough air to scream the names of her trainers. She was a champion swimmer, excellent in the pool, but the whales were stronger. Fellow trainer Karen McGee remembered the terrible incident. "I heard her scream my name," she said. She tried to throw rings for Keltie to grab, but the orcas wouldn't let her anywhere near safety. As time dragged on, the trainers became frantic. They tried to hook Keltie's body or catch her with a net, but to the whales, it was all a big game. After 10 minutes of this, Keltie's head popped up one more time. Those watching will never forget her dying screams as Keltie was again pulled down and her body dragged around the tank. It was the last time anybody would hear from her again. It was another 2 hours before the trainers managed to recover the limp body from the bottom of the pool. They attached weights to the net and managed to pull Keltie out of the water. But it was too late to resuscitate her. Keltie had just become the first human ever to be killed by a killer whale. The coroner's report listed her death as accidental, forcibly drowned by an orca. I can't imagine how hard it would have been to be a trainer at that aquarium. Despite what happened, they still had to feed the 3 orcas. They had to clean their tank, give them medicines, and play with these killers. How would you respond knowing they had drowned your friend but you still had to look after them? Because it wasn't an attack. It was a genuine accident. The whales were excited for their play session, and for them, Keltie was part of the fun. Because trainers weren't allowed to swim with the whales, Tilly got overwhelmed and excited to have Keltie in the pool with him. He didn't understand that what was fun for him was deadly for her. In fact, as Keltie stopped moving, the whales were careful to keep her near the surface. But by that point, it was already too late. Keltie's death meant the end of Sealand. The aquarium was closed soon after. The whales were shipped off to SeaWorld in Orlando, and aquariums and parks around the world suddenly appreciated the raw power and deadly might behind these seemingly gentle giants. Keltie's death forever changed how trainers worked with orcas. Although Keltie's death ended the aquarium, it wasn't the end for Tilly. It seems that although Tilly was one of the smartest orcas at the aquarium, he still hadn't learned his lesson. What I have next has to be one of the weirdest stories about someone dying from an orca attack. You already know the whale. But when I tell you what Tilly did, you'll have more questions than answers about what actually happened. On Tuesday morning, July 6, 1999, trainer Michael Dougherty showed up at SeaWorld Orlando for his morning shift. It was just after 7 a.m., and it was a good time to be at the park. The crowds were a couple of hours away from showing up. The attractions were still quiet, and the animals were just starting to wake. Just like any other routine workday, Michael walked into the viewing area below the waterline of G Pool, where SeaWorld held their orcas for research and breeding. He expected to see their enormous orca Tilly swimming around the tank. But what Michael found instead sparked off an investigation that no one can fully understand. As Michael came to the window looking into the tank, he saw what looked like feet in the pool next to Tilly. And when he climbed up the poolside, his worst fears were confirmed. There, draped over Tilly's back as he swam around his tank, was a naked man. A very naked and very dead man. But who was he? What happened to him? And how did he make his way into one of the most protected tanks in the whole park? Trainers and SeaWorld staff helped rescuers recover the body from the tank, but it still wasn't clear what had happened throughout the night. The man was blue in the face, with scratches and cuts all over his body. But there was only one bite mark, where Tilly had cleanly bit off the man's privates with his razor-sharp teeth. Next to the pool, they found a neatly stacked pile of clothes. Later, divers found several items in the pool, including 3 pieces of human remains floating around the tank. It looked like the man had decided to climb into Tilly's pool in the night and go for a little swim. I'd like to think that he didn't know that there was an orca in the pool. The pile of clothes did little to help the authorities solve the mystery. There were some scraps of paper, a couple of dollars in change, and a worn photo ID. Using the ID and some fingerprints, the investigators determined that this was the body of 27-year-old Daniel Dukes. But who was Daniel Dukes? A friend of someone in the park? There were still so many questions. Daniel didn't have a permanent address. He was a drifter around Florida, with several arrest reports on his record. He'd just been released a few days earlier, before coming down to Orlando. He had been staying in the Hare Krishna temple in Miami for a month before that. As best as the police could figure out, Daniel had bought a ticket for SeaWorld the day before. He must have found a place to hide out until the park was empty. And when no one was around, he decided to go for a swim with one of the most deadly animals the park had on display. Daniel probably just wanted to have some fun, but he didn't know anything about Tilly's deadly reputation. Remember, we don't have camera footage or witnesses. All we have is our best guess. Tilly was a curious whale, so Daniel's late-night dip would have instantly grabbed Tilly's attention. His lethal attention. He probably dragged Daniel down into 50-degree water, maybe for hours. And what about that bite? Animal experts who knew Tilly well said that he never would have seen swimming shorts like that before. Tilly was probably biting off the shorts to investigate them when he accidentally bit Daniel. He might have been trying to be really gentle, but gentle for whales is different from gentle for humans. I'm afraid that I am all out of facts here. All we have left are theories. And more questions. For example, how did no one spot a stranger sneaking around the park late at night? And why bother to set up cameras for the benefit of the animals if no one is watching them? And why did a cleaner not notice the pale, naked body of a man when he swept the pool earlier that morning? The only man who can answer those for us was Tilly's second victim. But again, Tilly remained on show at SeaWorld, because nobody at the park suspected that his third and final victim would be the most horrible of them all. When Dawn was just a 9-year-old girl, her family took her to SeaWorld. She was amazed by the orcas swimming past her in the tanks. Immediately, she said that she would become a whale trainer when she grew up. But unlike many other kids who say they'll be doctors or train conductors but never do, Dawn actually fulfilled her lifelong dream. She worked hard her whole life to become the person her 9-year-old self would have loved. In university, she studied animal psychology and behavior. She worked with dolphins for years, building up the skills to train marine mammals. She even worked hard outside of the pool to keep fit enough to handle the workload. And finally, when Dawn turned 27, she landed a job at SeaWorld in Orlando. Within 2 years of working at SeaWorld, Dawn became their head trainer. She was passionate about all animals, not just the whales under her care. In her own home, she kept ducks, chickens, rabbits, birds, and 2 black labs. And because of her infectious smile, Dawn became the face of SeaWorld. I mean, she was literally the poster girl for the park, featured on all the billboards, signs, and ads. She and Tilly. Dawn worked with all the orcas at SeaWorld, but by far, her favorite was Tilly. The 22-foot orca was kind, gentle, and very responsive to Dawn. The two of them shared a close bond that no other trainer had. Those who worked with Dawn would say that their relationship was special. She clearly loved Tilly, and it looked like Tilly loved her back. But can you ever really know what an animal is thinking? Can you ever predict what they'll do next? I suppose that with an animal like Tilly, you should be prepared for the worst. On February 24, 2010, Dawn was leading a private show called Dine with Shamu. For those lucky guests who paid extra, they got to eat a special lunch while Dawn and Tilly gave them a private performance. Normally, it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience with an up-close and personal show with a killer whale. Only this time, it was a performance that none of the guests would ever forget. The show wrapped up just after 1 p.m., and Dawn fed Tilly some extra herring she had in her cooler. And then Dawn lay down on a concrete slab right next to the pool. The slab allowed Dawn to get face-to-face with Tilly, in a position that trainers called a relationship session. Basically, Dawn talked to Tilly, reassured him, and stroked his nose and cheeks. It was meant to be a time to build bonding and trust, but something in the wild orca's brain switched. All of a sudden, Dawn's long ponytail drifted through the water over to Tilly's mouth, and without a sound, Tilly grabbed the hair and pulled Dawn down into the pool. But you should know that trainers never work alone with animals, especially an orca the size of Tilly. The killer whale was almost 100 times heavier than Dawn, which is why SeaWorld used a backup trainer to act as a lookout. On this day, Dawn's spotter sounded the alarm as soon as Dawn went below the surface. A call known as Signal 500 went out over every radio in the park. All employees knew the alarm. It meant that someone was in trouble in G-Pool, and that meant the worst kind of trouble. Someone was in with the killer whales. As trainers rushed to the poolside, 20 guests watched in horror as the whale hit and pounded against Dawn's body. Up and down and around again. Tilly swung Dawn around like she was nothing more than a plaything. Tilly would drop the hair and then grab Dawn by the foot or the arm, dragging her down deeper every time. Eventually, park employees ushered the stunned crowd away from the windows, but not before one girl innocently asked if she would be okay. I would have hated to be the one who had to tell that girl what had actually happened. When employees realized which whale was in G-Pool, they were struck dumb. Everyone at the park knew that when Tilly had something in his mouth, he didn't like to give it up. But today, he had his favorite trainer lodged firmly in his powerful jaws. The other trainers tried everything they could to distract Tilly or get him to release Dawn from the bottom. But he was a stubborn whale, and he ignored every command and whistle and slap on the water. After what felt like 30 minutes, trainers were finally able to corner Tilly and pry open his mouth to release Dawn. But she was already dead. Only after they pulled her body onto dry land did they realize that Tilly still had Dawn's arm in his teeth. Emergency crews pronounced her dead at the scene. The next day, the coroner listed the dozens of serious injuries Dawn suffered under the water. The report tells a ferocious tale, leaving no doubt that killer whales can be powerfully frightening predators. Amazingly, the coroner listed the death as accidental, but those who watched the horror unfold would never believe it. To those who watched Dawn's death, they could see that the killer whale knew exactly what he was doing. He had ignored years of trust, and in one bloody moment killed the one trainer who loved him the most. After the incident, SeaWorld banned all trainers from getting close to Tilly again, and the courts later found SeaWorld at fault for her death, saying that the park hadn't done enough to keep its trainers safe. Tilly never killed again, but his horrific attacks became legends, including a famous documentary about his life called Blackfish. He lived out the rest of his days at SeaWorld until he died at the old age of 36. If you take one thing away from these stories, it's that you should always respect Mother Nature. You can tame and train an animal, but it's always going to be an animal. Keep that in mind the next time you visit a zoo or an aquarium. Want to support the channel? Join for exclusive perks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.